Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Holtzman. I am a faculty member at Ball State. I'm a sociology professor. I'm also an expert in sexual violence prevention, especially at the campus level, obviously, given the talk today. So I'm going to be presenting kind of the first half of our talk, and Ashna's going to do the second half of our talk, but I'll let Ashna do her introduction first.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ashna. And as Jasmine said, I was from Ball State. I graduated with my PhD about 2 weeks ago. And now I am a professor in counseling psychology at a university in San Francisco. I'm really excited to be here. I hope to one day be an expert like Melissa is on sexual violence prevention. But I've been doing it like for the last 5 years, specifically in the Indian campus context. So I am delighted to be here with you and go through like the things that we found that have worked that hopefully um, y'all can take some kind of inspiration, guidance, guidelines from. So I'm really excited to be here today.
Excellent. Thanks, Ashna. So, as you can see from the title of our talk, we're obviously going to be talking about what we've learned in the campus sexual violence prevention arena, and then how that can translate to other arenas. So, some of the folks on the call, some of you may be affiliated with campuses, but I imagine a fair number of you are affiliated with community organizations and things of that nature. So, our ultimate goal is to give you background on what we know about campus sexual violence prevention and then talk about how that would translate to other arenas as well. I like to run presentations very dialogue heavy. I like for there to be interaction. So, I'm going to at times ask you all questions and invite you to converse with us. Of course, if folks are, not comfortable with that, or, there's no pressure, obviously. But you might hear me on occasion say, "Hey, are you familiar with this? Are you familiar with that?" Kind of inviting some dialogue. And if folks are open to that, great, we'll run with it. If folks are like, not so much, then, I'll adjust and we'll run with that. So just kind of give you a sense of how I tend to like to run presentations. So in order to kind of provide you with the information that we have in mind, this is the agenda that we're going to follow. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple different kinds of sexual violence prevention programs that are really standard on college campuses and lay out some of the historical trajectory across really the last 40 years to help us understand where we've been and where we are going in this arena. And that's important because college campuses really have been trying to address this problem since the 1980s. So we have a lot of background information, a lot of programs that have been tried, that have been evaluated. As you can see, I'm going to talk about program evaluation information as well. So we have a pretty good sense of what doesn't work, what does work, what kind of works, et cetera, et cetera. So in order to give you the information that we'd like to share on college campuses and then how it's applicable to other institutions, I feel like this background information is pretty necessary because it will help you understand why the things that we say are working today, why we need to design programs in those ways because we have tested variations across time and not had as much success until really the last 10 years or so. So anyway, I'll come back to that. And then again, of course, we'll also be talking about applications to community-based intervention as I noted. So that's kind of letting you know where we're going. And again, I'm going to do kind of the first half of this, and Ashna will take over and do the second half. So I noted that I wanted to talk about a couple different kinds of sexual violence prevention programs on college campuses. These are the two most prominent versions, risk reduction training, primary prevention training. So here's my first question to the group. And by the way, I can't see all of you. So if you unmute yourself and just, talk, that's great. If you put something in the chat, that's great. But my first question is, how many people have heard of these concepts, risk reduction, primary prevention? Anybody know what either of them are? I'm just kind of scanning through the names. Okay. All right. So Beth says, yes, she thinks that she knows what they are. Do you want to unmute and kind of give us a sense, Beth, or do you want me to just go ahead and keep going? I mean, I would
Sure,
love for
this
you to. give me a
This is
guess as
Beth.
to.
This is Beth. Sorry, I'm off
Okay.
camera because nobody needs to see what I look like today. I think risk reduction training, if I understand it, is focused on potential victims and how to keep themselves safe.
That's
And
right.
then primary prevention is the I think a broader. So I mean, we do primary prevention work here at the coalition with our partners.
Exactly.
I teach at IU Indianapolis, actually one class a semester,
Okay.
and they do sort of a piece of this for the faculty a little bit, like what to look for and what to do, in response and that sort of thing. And that's really more of the primary prevention.
Okay,
Um,
absolutely. That's a really
Thanks.
great summary. Bailey also chimed in that they're familiar with these concepts as well. But Beth summarized them really well. Risk reduction is very much focused on victims. It is primarily about teaching victims how to keep themselves safe, and that's typically been done in a couple different ways. One is self-defense training, the other is behavior change advice. So self-defense training is kind of self-explanatory. You know, you're teaching somebody how to protect themselves if they're in a threatening situation. Traditionally, that has involved violent physical self-defense techniques. I'm going to come back and talk about that in a minute. So that's the self-defense piece. The behavior change piece traditionally also involved things like don't walk alone at night, don't wear certain kinds of clothing, right? This is what we mean by behavior change. Now, those things are problematic for a variety of reasons, which I imagine many people are familiar with. I'll come back and talk about that a little bit later as well. But just to kind of give you this overview, traditionally, um, early on in the history of college campuses trying to deal with this issue, risk reduction is where we started and what we were most focused on. And it was this self-defense piece and this behavior change piece. All right. The other program type is primary prevention, which you also heard Beth talking about. And you'll notice here that that one says it's culture focused. So primary prevention is really about trying to change the way people think about sexual violence, sexual assault, bodily integrity, alcohol consumption on college campuses, all of these kinds of things. It's about trying to change people's understanding so that we can address the problem at its root, right? We need to deal with the kinds of cultural messages that we have that implicitly and unfortunately sometimes explicitly condone sexual violence. And so primary prevention is really about this educational training, awareness training, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Um, the most important piece at this point in the conversation is that one is victim focused, one is culture focused. And that is important because obviously those are two very different ways of addressing the problem. And traditionally, these styles of prevention programming have been kind of seen to conflict with one another. So I'm going to kind of take us back to the 1980s and kind of start my historical projection now or discussion. And I'm doing that again because the 1980s is really when scholars started to recognize and started to talk about the fact that college campuses can be very dangerous places for students, especially female students. So that's when we started to see the stats that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5, again, depending on how they've collected the data. So 20 to 25% of college women will experience an assault before they graduate. Researchers were much slower to recognize that this could be a problem with male students as well. Once they did start to investigate that, they recognized that yes, male students do experience assault, especially if they are gay or bisexual male students. Sexual orientation is actually strongly associated with the risk of assault, regardless of the person's gender. Uh, but again, for my purposes right now, kind of thinking about this from the historical trajectory, there wasn't a ton of focus on men early on. So these early programs in the 1980s, scholars are saying, look, college campuses are really dangerous places for students. Women are facing, assault rates at 20 to 25% before they graduate. This is something that we really need to address. So what happened is campuses, scholars start proliferating early on these risk reduction programs. The argument being, if we can teach people self-defense, we can keep them safe, right? So we're going to try to prevent sexual violence or shut down sexual violence by teaching people how to keep themselves safe. So in the early 80s, these programs start to proliferate. These are two of the more famous programs. Again, both started in the 80s. RAD stands for Rape Aggression Defense. Anybody here familiar with RAD? I see some people nodding their heads for the folks that have their video on. So RAD is basically a program that is run by either city police departments or campus police departments. And it is basically the police officers train the individuals that take these programs in self-defense. It has one of the largest networks of trained instructors in the entire US. There are more than 10,000 police officers trained to offer rad training on college campuses and in local city communities. All right. So again, starts in the 1980s. Impact is another program of note that starts in the late 80s. And Impact was actually the result of a variety of sexual violence organizations from a number of metropolitan areas across the US. DC and Seattle and LA and Boston. Those organizations come together. They say, hey, we need to create a program that will address this risk. They create Impact, and it now has chapters all across the US. What's important about these programs and many of the other programs that started in the 80s is again, they're focused on violent physical self-defense techniques. The thought was if you give somebody those skills, they can keep themselves safe. So if we proliferate these kinds of programs, we will naturally see sexual violence victimization rates go down. This was the hope, this was the expectation. Unfortunately, that is not what happened. And that is because the kinds of things that we teach people in traditional self-defense, kind of the thing that you see on the screen here, is how to break somebody's nose, how to use an elbow, how to use a knee strike, all of those kinds of things. Those are super well suited techniques if you're dealing with a stranger assault. They are actually not very good techniques if you're dealing with an acquaintance assault. Anybody want to guess why that might be the case? I'll just give people a second here, see if anybody wants to unmute themselves or write in the chat. If not, I will tell you. But so violent physical self-defense works really good with a stranger, but not so good with an acquaintance.
With an acquaintance, they wouldn't be really sneaking up on you.
Okay, so you're less likely to like need to throw an elbow backwards because like the person is not sneaking up on you. All right. Anybody else want to take a
Think
guess?
with an acquaintance, you're less likely to be able to exhibit the level of violence that you would need or the level of aggression that you would need to defend yourself.
That's exactly right, Whitney. And Angela said something similar. You may not want to hurt them like you would a stranger. That is the key to this issue. Um, People often don't want to do damage to somebody that they know, somebody they might even care about. Could be a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a classmate or a long-term friend, right? Could just be a casual acquaintance, but it's still somebody that you know, somebody that you're going to see regularly. And people often aren't willing to utilize violence against that individual. I'm going to tell you a quick story about a student that I had at Ball State to help illustrate this point, and then I'll kind of wrap back around to why all of this matters. So this student comes up to me. She saw me at some point during the semester, and she's like, "Hey, Melissa, I want to tell you about an experience I had on campus, and I want you to tell me what you would have done." I'm like, okay. So she says she's at a party on campus at some point, and as parties are, very crowded and very loud, and she finds herself kind of backed up against a wall. So her back's to the wall, and there's people all around her, and there's a young man standing in front of her, and he grabs a hold of the waistband of her pants, and he's jostling the waistband of her pants like he's going to take her pants down. And the more she protests, the funnier he thinks this is. So she's asking him nicely. She's telling him to quit. She's yelling at him, right? She's escalating in all these different ways, verbally trying to get him to stop. And he thinks this is funnier and funnier. She can't move backwards. She can't really move sideways. It's super, super loud. So she's having difficulty getting attention of other people to help her. So she stops her story right there and she says, "So what would you have done?" And I said, "Well, given that you've asked him nicely several times, you're trying to get this guy to quit and you don't really have another exit strategy, I think I would have brought my knee straight up the center and given him a shot to the groin. And this is what she said to me. She's like, yeah, but I had to see him in class the next day and I didn't want to hurt him. And that is super critical, right? My response, which is, okay, I would use something kind of physically painful on this guy at this point, is not necessarily her response. It's easy for me to say that in this situation because I don't know the kid. He's not my acquaintance. He was her acquaintance. So the point is that when we designed these risk reduction programs in the 80s and we ran with the idea that self-defense is self-defense and that all sexual assaults are the same, we actually did our students a disservice because we were arming them with techniques that they ultimately weren't necessarily going to be able or be willing to use in every situation that they found themselves in, right? Unfortunately, as researchers start to recognize that these things aren't working, they don't put together that this is the problem. So let me give you a little bit of the program evaluation data on these early programs, and then I'll tie these things together. So as these programs proliferate in the 80s, might not be surprised to find out that the next thing scholars do is say, we need to test this. We need to figure out, is this working? And of course, again, as I said earlier, they expect this to work. They're like, we're going to see the 1 in 5 rates go down, the 1 in 4 rates. This is going to be much better. We're going to have figured out how to combat this problem. But as I've already alluded to, that's not at all what happened. In fact, study after study after study showed that there was no relationship between having self-defense training and lower rates of victimization. So that's why the screen says SV rates remain steady. This does not mean that risk reduction training, self-defense training wasn't positive and beneficial. It did do a lot for people's, especially women, because again, most of the time this is what we're talking about in the 80s, their self-empowerment, their feelings of self-assurance, things of that nature. But it didn't actually lower rates of assault. And that is the gold standard, right? That's what we're after. We want to lower rates of assault. So that's problematic. And again, as these studies are coming out, researchers are like, wow, this is not working. What is wrong? Well, it must be the self-defense doesn't work. They didn't recognize initially that it was the kind of self-defense that was being taught, that we weren't giving people enough nuance, that we weren't giving them enough choice. And so some of the argument became, well, we got to throw our hands up, self-defense, risk reduction doesn't work. That was coupled with lots of concerns that self-defense training, that risk reduction training often also promotes victim blaming, which you can see there on the screen as well. So I would like to ask folks if they know why somebody might argue that self-defense training results in victim blaming. Does anybody know the connection between those two?
Or wants to take a guess, even if you don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Take a guess. I'm
Excuse me,
scrolling
I
through
would
the
guess
notes.
that it implies some, you should have done this.
Yeah, I don't know who said that because I didn't get through the
Kelly.
screen fast enough to see who was talking. But yes, you're right.
Sorry, it
There
was
would be the
Kelly.
assumption that, hey, this should have worked, right? Beth said something similar. If you were just good enough at it, you should have been safe. Angela says because people assume that you should be fighting them off instead of punishing the people for trying to sexually assault you, etc. So all of these things are right. So we have all of this data collected that says, gosh, this isn't actually lowering victimization rates. At the same time, people are starting to say, why are we teaching victims to protect themselves and not perpetrators not to perpetrate? We've got our focus in the wrong place. So we end up blaming victims by putting the onus on them to keep themselves safe instead of asking perpetrators not to perpetrate or teaching perpetrators not to perpetrate, right? We have all this behavior change argument in early sexual risk reduction, sexual violence prevention, don't walk alone at night, don't wear certain kinds of clothing. Again, as I noted earlier, highly inappropriate, right? People should be able to wear what they want, drink what they want, go where they want, whenever they want. They shouldn't have to monitor their own behavior to keep themselves safe. So there was concern that those messages were promoting victim blaming. And then some of the other things that you guys noted, There was concern that victims would blame themselves if they were trained in self-defense and then they tried to use it and it failed, right? So they'd be like, I should have been able to prevent this. Research hasn't actually borne that out. Most folks who are trained in some kind of self-defense tend not to hold themselves accountable, even if the self-defense failed. But again, early in the 80s, we didn't, and 90s, we didn't have those studies yet. So there was this concern. And then this is probably more problematic. Even if the victim themselves doesn't hold themselves accountable, there was concern that society would hold them accountable. Well, you had the training, you could have stopped it if you wanted to, right? And so even if they don't self-blame, other people would blame. And again, we would promote this kind of victim blaming culture. So we've got these two things coming together, and then we've got one additional piece that kind of all coalesce at the same time to make the field of prevention say no more risk reduction. And that third piece is this argument that self-defense programs at their core cannot actually prevent violence. They're reactionary, right? They might prevent something from escalating, but if we really want to prevent violence, we have to change culture, which I talked about earlier. We have to change the way people think about these issues. We have to educate folks so that we never have initial perpetration to begin with, because everybody understands that this isn't appropriate behavior. That's where the primary prevention piece comes in. And so I often refer to this as the pendulum swing because by the early 2000s, so we've got 20 years worth of data, 80s and 90s. 80s is when we're proliferating the programs, 90s is when we're testing them and we're not getting the results we want. Early in the 2000s, we basically don't see a minor shift away from risk reduction. We see a full pendulum swing where people are like, don't do self-defense training at all. Don't do risk reduction at all. Instead, we need to be focused on what has come to be called primary prevention. And that really, the impetus behind that movement, and again, many of you have already noted that you work on primary prevention on your own or in your own organization. The impetus behind that movement actually comes from two white papers that were released by the American College Health Association, the ACHA, and the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, both in early to mid 2000s. So each of these organizations put out white papers that emphasize we've got to be changing culture. We have to be teaching people about bodily integrity, about how to give and get consent, about the risks of alcohol on college campuses, all of these kinds of things. We need to be teaching people to do these things differently. And at the time, the ACHA and the CDC explicitly said, we need to leave risk reduction behind. We need to leave self-defense behind. It promotes victim blaming. It's not going to change culture. We need to be doing primary prevention and primary prevention only. All right, so that's what we start to see in the 2000s. And that's really where most campuses are still today. Although there's going to be a shift potentially away from that based on some of the things that Aashna and I are going to talk to you about. And the ACHA and the CDC have backed off on that recommendation now based on some of the stuff that we're going to talk about as we move forward today. But in the early 2000s, they're like, nope, no more primary or no more risk reduction. We're only doing primary prevention. So just like I gave you a couple examples of risk reduction programs that proliferated in the 80s, here are a couple primary prevention programs that became really popular in the early 2000s. Green Dot, Know Your Power. Anybody familiar with these? I see some heads nodding of the folks that have their videos on. Yeah, absolutely. So Green Dot is one of the more well-known bystander intervention programs. And a bystander intervention program, and I imagine many of you are familiar with this, but just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page, bystander intervention programs are really focused on teaching people how to recognize sexual threats early and how to intervene on behalf of somebody else in order to prevent them from escalating. And then there's also a piece of bystander intervention that also focuses a lot on supporting victims if somebody actually experiences an assault, being there for them to help them move through that healing process. But the vast majority of bystander intervention is really about let's recognize this threat soon and let's help shut it down. And there are a variety of different ways that training is given. People are given a lot of different strategies for intervention. I'm not going to go into all that detail. But Green Dot developed at the University of Kentucky, again in the early 2000s, and it has now proliferated across the world. Like there are chapters of Green Dot across the globe. So this is a really, really well-known bystander intervention program. Know Your Power is a different kind of primary prevention program. So it looks like maybe you're going to have something on. I just saw something come up in the chat about upcoming training topics. So maybe a little bit of bystander interventions coming on. Anyway, so Know Your Power is a different kind of primary prevention, and that is what we call a social marketing campaign. And so a social marketing campaign is kind of a media blitz of sorts, so that you've got posters and bookmarks, and I've even seen bus wraps, so that when people are walking around college campuses, they're getting this message from all kinds of different places. And those messages are, again, see something, say something, those kinds of things, right? Intervene. If you see this kind of interaction unfolding, this is a problem, et cetera, et cetera. Again, trying to educate folks, raise their awareness, and then also get them to be willing to step in and help should that be necessary. Know Your Power started at the University of New Hampshire, which also actually incidentally hosts another one of the most well-known bystander intervention programs, which is called Bringing in the Bystander. But so Know Your Power is the social marketing campaign that was developed at New Hampshire. And you can now purchase social marketing campaign materials from the University of New Hampshire within this Know Your Power campaign. They'll, make it fit your particular messaging, what you need for your particular campus or organization, whatever it happens to be. Okay. All right. So my last little thing before I turn it over to Ashna is to do one more discussion point on the evaluation data. And that is just like we evaluated the risk reduction stuff starting in the late 2000s to, early 2010s, we are evaluating the primary prevention stuff. And just as we expected risk reduction to lower victimization rates, we had every hope, aspiration, expectation that that would be the case for primary prevention, but it actually hasn't shown to be true. You can see there that what we find are short-term attitude impacts and people talking about their intentions to intervene, but not necessarily actual intervention behaviors. So I'll break that down a little bit and then we'll move forward. So most research that has studied the impact of a primary prevention program has looked at, does this change people's attitudes? And what they typically find is that students report right after taking the program, absolutely. I think about these things differently. I understand consent better. I understand the risks of alcohol better. And I have intentions to intervene. If I see something, I intend to step in now that I've had this training. Unfortunately, though, when we study this longitudinally, what we find is that most of those attitude changes basically dissipate by about 9 weeks. So about 9 weeks post-program, students have returned to baseline. So wherever they were before they took the program, that's where they are now. The training isn't sticking for some reason, and their intention to intervene isn't actually often translated into actual behavior. So when researchers have studied actual intervention behaviors, not just intentions, they have found that there are a whole lot of things that prevent students from actually engaging in that intervention behavior, even when they've got the training and they say, yeah, I recognize there was a problem. In fact, several studies have actually shown that nearly every student surveyed in the research has said, yep, I have witnessed sexual violence, dating violence. I have witnessed these things on college campus. Nearly every student surveyed has said those things. They know that they're seeing it, but in no situation have students intervened in every situation they've seen unfolding. All right. In fact, one study shows that 40% of students knowingly choose not to intervene, even when they're faced with a situation that they recognize as a threat. So we've got a lot of training going into getting folks to be willing to intervene, but we also have a lot of students now telling us on the back half of that, yeah, I recognize it's a problem, but I don't really feel comfortable intervening. Or I don't want to intervene because I don't want to upset the cultural norms of hookup culture on a college campus. Other students have reported that the reasons they don't intervene is because they don't want to create drama. Or I find that this is the saddest of all the statistics. They don't intervene because they want to create drama. That is really troubling. They don't want to step on the toes of a higher status student. They don't feel like they actually have the skills to intervene. Like, yeah, I was taught some things, but I don't know that I can actually enact it. Or I didn't think it was bad enough. Like, yeah, I saw something, but I didn't know if it was enough to intervene. In other words, the point is that at the end of the day, primary prevention is not sufficient in and of itself to effectively address this problem because we have a lot of students that are telling us, yeah, I'm not ultimately going to actually be able to do that. All right. So that suggests that we need something slightly different, right? Sexual violence is a multifaceted problem and it probably needs a multifaceted response. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Ashna and she's going to talk about kind of where we are in modern times, what has developed in the last 10 years or so, what we know about it, and why it works. All right.
Sounds good. Thank you for that great foundation, Melissa. So, to recap everything Melissa said, we spent about 20 years doing a lot of risk reduction, which was focused on behavior change and which was focused on self defense. What we found from that is that it's still not reducing the statistics of 1 in 5 or 1 in 4, right? Then we spent about 10 to 20 years doing a lot of culture change, bystander behavior kind of programs, which hope that if we educate people enough about, hey, this is what's going on, this is what might be going on for you, which is why you are not able to respond. These are some different ways in which you can respond. These are the ways in which you can step in. Maybe that will change. But that also didn't change anything. Because, like Melissa was saying, what that meant was we had an immediate shift in attitudes after people completed the programs, but those shift in attitudes did not persist over time. Meaning, if I attended a bystander intervention program last year at this time, that gives me no guarantee that that created enough of a foundational shift for how I think about the world to actually stop an instance of sexual violence that's happening in front of me, or that's happening to me, or to my friend, or to a family member. So in about like between 2010, 2015, a couple of scholars, including Melissa, they started to think about how do we combine both of these things? How do we combine what we know about risk reduction and how do we combine what we know about primary prevention or culture change into one program? Because no approach is all beneficial and no approach is all limitations. Each approach has its benefits and has its limitations. So they came up with what's called the comprehensive sexual violence prevention approaches, which emphasizes that, hey, let's take the best practices from all of the self-defense stuff going on. Let's take the best practices from all of these like cultural education pieces going on and put them together in one program and see what happens. Cool things happen. So can you go to the next one, please, Melissa? Slide
Can
12.
you not see it? I did advance it. You want beyond this one?
I want slide 12. I think the next one. Yes.
Okay, got it. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Oh, no, I was wrong. Sorry.
Okay.
Previous one. My bad. Okay. But the thing is that there's a very important caveat to these programs. Do you all remember how before when Melissa asked you, why do you think risk reduction programs may not work? You all came up with some great answers like, I may not want to use so much force on someone who's not a stranger, or I'd feel awkward doing that. So what these modern programs are trying to do is take into account the statistics which were ignored previously, which is who are the people who are perpetrating violence. And more than 70% of the time, they are people that you know, which means that before the last decade, most of the time we were having programming that emphasized how to protect yourself and others from violence that is perpetrated by strangers. But that is not the reality. And that could be one of the main reasons why these skills that the participants were learning in programs were not working. So what these newer programs tried to do was they tried to provide a much more nuanced approach to self-defense. And by nuanced, I mean not just looking at self-defense as let me break your nose, let me hit your balls real hard, let me just push you away and run away screaming. Because those things may not work if it's your boyfriend. Those things may not work if it's your cousin. And those things may not work if it's your classmate who you have to see the next day, even if you're not friends with them, right? So, what these programs started to do was, well, firstly, they started to emphasize how can we use existing psychological research to provide different methods of self-defense. And by that, I mean, I call it emotional self-defense first and then verbal, right? So, by emotional self-defense, I mean, how are you able to remind yourself that if I am uncomfortable right now, my discomfort is valid and I can stand up for myself in this moment? Because a lot of studies have found that people question their realities while they are happening. And we may not feel firmly enough that, oh, I can like risk our relationship to make sure that I'm not going to be assaulted in this moment. Because why would you think that someone who who you think cares about you would hurt you? But unfortunately, that does happen sometimes. So, firstly, there's the whole emotional part of it. Then there's the verbal part of it. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later. But what are techniques that we can take from psychology, from persuasion, from the social sciences that we can use to almost give ourselves a template for if I want something, this is how I go about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But the point is that taking into account all of these different ways of doing self-defense is quite radically different than the risk reduction programs of the 80s and 90s. Because over here, we're including a lot more nuance and we're really talking about who the perpetrator is. And most of the time, the perpetrator is not somebody you don't know. So very briefly, we're going to talk about 3 programs that have combined primary prevention education and risk reduction training within a single program. So there's EAAA, or Enhanced Acknowledge, Assess, and Act. That's also called Flip the Script. And that was developed in Canada by Charlene Sen and a group of her colleagues. It offers a lot of lessons on alcohol, consent, and communication, along with verbal and physical self-defense training. So as you can see, there's a focus on culture on campuses by talking about alcohol consumption, how that relates to party culture, what is consent, how do you talk through it, how do you experience it for yourself, and how do you firmly assert those boundaries with others, plus verbal and physical self-defense. Then there was Elemental, that was created by Melissa and her colleague at Ball State. And what Elemental focused on is it's a scenario-based training program, which means that there are a variety of scenarios of where sexual assault may take place. And they taught people how to respond differently to all of these things. And what I think is so cool about Elemental is it offers so many different options for how to respond. And it can truly help you understand that, hey, if that is not the kind of person I am, then that is okay because I can find a way of defending myself based on the kind of person I am. And then there's Prevent and Protect, which is something that Melissa, another one of my colleagues, and I created. And this one was specifically for creating comprehensive sexual violence prevention programming for Indian college students. And this is one of the reasons why I was really excited for doing this program, for doing this training today, because I know that who we have here today, everybody is not just associated with a campus, right? But I'm here to tell you that we can take all of these lessons that we learned for campus programming and apply it to different contexts. Does it take a bit of work? Absolutely. right? But I think the most important thing is that there are applicable and transferable lessons from all of this sexual violence prevention programming that we've done on campuses in the US and Canada and apply it to different social settings. So back to prevent and protect. So that one talked a lot about what is culture like for students in India, because that's not the same as campus culture in the US, and that's not the same as campus culture in Canada. So we focused a lot on stereotypes, myths, especially surrounding Indian women's sexuality and relationship norms. Plus, all of this stuff about physical, emotional, and non-verbal, verbal and non-verbal self. And with Melissa's program, Elemental, and Charlene Sen's program, EAAA, over a decade of research shows that more than 66% of participants who did these programs, they did not experience sexual assault after doing the program compared to the people who did not do the program, which is a fantastic thing. It's a truly, truly fantastic thing. And that also tells us that there is a lot of promise in combining the risk reduction approaches along with the primary prevention approaches. So let's take the quote Miley Cyrus, take the best of both worlds and put it together, and then great things happen. So, um, so in sum, the key to effective prevention is you think about what cultures do these people live in. And by that, I don't mean like what country do they live in, right? So if you have students on a college campus, then that's going to have a specific kind of culture. If you are working, say, at a domestic violence shelter, you're going to talk about a different culture in that context. If you are talking about sexual violence prevention within religious community, that is a different kind of culture. I'm not saying that there aren't overlapping elements. There absolutely are, right? But when we think about changing attitudes towards sexual violence, we need to be thinking about, well, what is informing those attitudes? And that is why we need to really be tapping into where are these people coming from? What is their community? Who is sending them these messages? And therefore, what are the messages that they are being sent? And then accordingly, alter the attitudes that could promote sexual violence or condone sexual violence in the community. The next one is empower victims, right? Or survivors. And this is really, really important because I'm going to talk about this later. But there's a lot of research that indicates when someone knows how to take care of themselves, they're a lot more likely to take care of themselves. I know it doesn't sound like genius logic, but people forget that a lot of times. And lastly, a comprehensive prevention approach, which means a prevention approach that combines primary prevention or attitude change, plus providing participants with skills, with tools about how to protect themselves. That combination is what creates the most lasting change. All right. So before I go on to this, I'm wondering what y'all think. What do you think, based on everything Melissa and I talked about, can be applicable for the settings in which you are? Are we thinking? Are we typing? Okay, let me change the question a little bit. If you know how to take care of yourself, or if in your work you find that you are with people who know how to take care of themselves, how do you think that might impact their ability to live the life they want to lead and resist the life that they don't want to lead, especially for sexual violence? Okay, no worries. So research indicates that when people know how to protect themselves, it increases their sense of empowerment, which makes sense. People also, especially women, they report much greater levels of assertiveness, self-efficacy, which means their faith in themselves that they can do something, and it reduces their anxiety, their helplessness, and their fear about going into situations that they may be uncertain. Um, First, I think that that's a great point. It will make those more familiar about what to do, and they will be less targeted. Absolutely. Because when you know what to do, that means you also know what not to do. For example, the other day I was at lunch with some people who are maybe with two women, one of whom was 5 years older than me, and one of whom was 7 years older than me. And the one who was 7 years older than me said that I think being assertive is a bad thing. And I was like, mm, that that does not vibe with me. But then the person who was 5 years older than me said, no, I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think like being aggressive is sometimes bad, but I don't think being assertive is a bad thing. Right? Now, me sitting there watching this interaction between these two women was interesting because both of them are in tech, you know, and they're surrounded by men all the time. And I'm in psychology and I am only surrounded by women. And I do all of the sexual violence prevention stuff, which teaches me the importance of being assertive and, when necessary, being aggressive, which means that I know what to do and I know what not to do based on the situation. But that is also how I have been trained. And that is not how they had been trained, right? So if we take that and apply it to this context, I think, yes, that's a fantastic point. It goes back to knowing who has power and how much power do I have. Because something that I don't question at all now is I deserve to take up space. I deserve to not be assaulted. I deserve to not be uncomfortable. But not everybody thinks that. Not everybody believes that. And a lot of times people have been socially trained in their families, within their cultures, within their countries to make themselves smaller or to put up with whatever's going on. And so if I have this information that no, I don't have to be that person, that means that I can behave in ways so that I am not that person. Um, and I'm just going to say one more thing about how comprehensive prevention training is being, I'm going to say, marketed now by the CDC, going back to Melissa's point that the CDC's recommendations have changed. They are now calling this empowerment-based self-defense training. And by that, I mean, it's essentially, I think, just comprehensive sexual violence prevention training. Um, but it's very important that when you are being trained on these topics, the people who are doing these programs, we need to have instructors who model self-confidence and who teach practical self-defense skills that can be modified by the participants based on the situation and based on who they are. And it's also very important that within these situations, you incorporate mock assaults. So, for example, excuse me, both elemental and prevent and protect, we spend a lot of time just having participants practice yelling. And it's wild. Like, you'd think that people would enjoy having that release of energy from their bodies. No, it takes so much convincing to get them to shout or even speak loudly when they're practicing being assaulted and how they would respond to something like that. And I bring up the yelling example because yelling is something that we all have access to. We may not all have access to the most high level martial arts programming, right? But we can all raise our voices. But it's so different for them to realize that, oh my God, I can actually yell. But then once they start yelling, it's like, oh, this is fantastic. You're really feeling your power, you know? So incorporating mock assaults on program participants is really, really important. And the other thing that's important, which speaks to the culture aspect, is naming the social systems that condone sexual violence. For example, um, over here, um, naming that the patriarchy exists and therefore sexual violence is condoned by the patriarchy is important. But it's also important to talk about social systems in an accessible manner. So, for instance, when I was doing this work in India, um, I wasn't implementing the program in a group of people who were very familiar with the idea of social systems. So I had to really figure out, okay, how am I going to explain this concept that seems complex but is actually woven into the fabric of everyday life for you? And what I realized in that is that people know exactly what you're talking about if you know how to share with them things in a way that they will get it. Because nobody is stupid. Everybody's pretty smart, and we need to treat them like that. And we just need to explain it in a way that, oh, this is how you can relate to it. And more often than not, they do relate. Um, can you move on to the next one, please?
Maybe my computer's, there we
Okay.
go. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. All right. So we just wanted to talk a little bit about verbal self-defense, and I'm going to throw this out to y'all first. What do you think makes people get convinced? How do you tend to get your way if you really want something?
Ask.
Mm-hmm. Convince other people you are right. Absolutely, with me. If you don't mind sharing, how do you convince
I'm very convincing.
them? Okay, say
No,
more. Say
I
more.
think usually it's just right. Like you present your case, you say, here are all of the reasons why I think I'm right. If they have any
Mm-hmm.
kind of opposition,
Mm-hmm.
you highlight for them
Mm-hmm.
kind of why your points are correct in face of their
Mm-hmm.
opposition. For me, it's almost always kind of like verbal
Yeah.
convincing.
Yeah. So I'm hearing you say that it's very logical for you. This
Yes.
is my situation. This is why I think I'm correct. This is why I think, even in the face of opposition, that I am still correct or more correct, right?
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
I love that. And I think that the principle of consistency goes really well with that, because a part of the logic is like sometimes tying back into, you remember how you said that thing 4 weeks ago? This ties into that. And this is why you should be on my side, right? Um, being confident, repetitive behaviors, really great ideas. I think the being confident is ties back into the emotional self-defense that I was talking about, because you need to feel within yourself that I have a right to be here and take up this space and talk about things. Um, and in general, a lot of persuasion research has shown that people take more accountability when you just say their name. So, for example, when Whitney, you wrote convince other people you are right, something I did was convince other people you're right. Thanks, Whitney, or something like that. I used your name, right? So that brings you more into the narrative. Asking questions is a great idea. Using let statements, which we also call collaborative commands, is basically a nice way of telling somebody that, hey, this is what we're doing, while not coming across as overly rude. For example, um, oh, Jasmine did this at the beginning when it was 10 a.m. for y'all on East Coast. And then she said, let's wait for other people to join. I'm going to give them about 3 to 4 minutes and then we'll start. Right. So she was subtly communicating to Melissa and I that, hey, this is the plan. Get on board. But it was said in a really nice way. Jasmine, I say that with love. Okay. Just saying. Um, and then a lot of persuasion research emphasize the importance of just explaining why. And we can do that by saying, because X, Y, and Z. So there was this research study that was conducted where there was a Xerox machine and there was a long line of people. And then you had someone who would just cut the line and say, hey, can I cut the line? Because I'm in a rush. And then 93% of people let them go. And they were like, sure, you can cut in the line. And to me, that's wild because in the US, I feel like everyone's obsessed with lines and no one wants to let anybody cut lines, you know? Um, and then even when people said that I want to cut the line because I want to make copies, which is obviously the reason everybody's there in the line, they were still let, they were still allowed to cut the line. So that just tells you if you just say because, even if it sounds like a ridiculous reason in your head, just say it because it's more likely that people will just listen to you. Deception and disgust. So I think these are things which are very important, especially in the prevention of sexual assault context. The deception part, it's okay to make things up. And it's okay to say, hey, I need to go right now because I have plans with my other friend. You may not have any friend, but who cares? Lie. Get out of there because leaving is an excellent self-defense tactic if you can use it. And the other thing is, a lot of times, like studies show that um, disgust can be a real turnoff. So, for example, pretending that, okay, I have this really bad cold right now and I'm going to sneeze in your face if you do something, or I'm going to throw up. But the thing is, the caveat with this is that do not use disgust related to anything that's associated with your genitals. So saying that I have a UTI right now, I have a fungal infection in my vagina, or I'm on my period, like those things do not elicit disgust in the same way and stop sexual arousal on the part of the perpetrator as much as like disgust for these other kinds of things, like throwing up or like sneezing in their face, things like that. Okay. All right. Can you move to the next one, please? Okay. So this is another part of the nonviolent self-defense. And the reason I think this is so important is because when people think about self-defense, they don't think about these basic principles. And once again, you do not need to be a high-level martial artist to be able to do these things. So a lot of times we are trained like socially to not take up much space, but we can use that to our advantage. And then we can take up more space. For example, literally just flinging your arms out wide is you taking up space. And if you hit the person who's perpetrating you, big deal. They were like being not great in the first place. Secondly, disrupting their balance is fairly easy if you know how to do it. For example, if you stand with staggered feet, your balance will increase. If you stand with staggered feet, one foot in front of the other, your balance will increase even more. If you stand with staggered feet, one foot in front of the other, and push someone in their waistline, they will fall because you have better balance than them and you have disrupted their center of gravity. So these are like these small principles that you can just use to get yourselves out of tricky situations. And the last one, which I almost just say to myself over and over, not just for sexual assault situations, but just life these days, is move what you can, not what you can't, or do what you can, not what you can't, right? So, for example, um, in the story that Melissa was talking about with one of her students, when there was the student's classmate who was kind of like jostling the pants, it felt to me like that student was doing every single thing that she could do in the moment. She asked nicely. That was the first step. Okay, this guy just thinks it's funnier and funnier each minute that this goes by. And then she asks more firmly. And then she has a thought of, okay, like maybe I want to kick him. But then she decides not to do that because she has to see him in class the next day. Right. So once again, like she is going through these things of what can I do? What can I not do? What can I do? What can I not do? And we're all capable of thinking these things through. We are all really, really smart and intelligent and capable people. And I think if we operate from the assumption that if I'm in a pickle, I can figure it out. And even if I cannot figure it out to the ideal maximum, that still doesn't make it my fault. I think we're all here and we're all thinking those things and we're on the same page. Um, yes. Okay. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that, but okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Um, so overall, um, there are these are just a few examples of topics that could be adapted for non-college audiences. And I think this goes back into what I was saying about you need to know who these people are to understand what their culture is, to understand what their influences are. And therefore, all of these points are going to be adapted accordingly. So, what are the types of sexual violence that are experienced within these specific groups that you're working with? What are the demographic risk factors? Because that changes across the lifespan, that changes according to race and ethnicity, that changes according to disability status, that changes according to um, sexual orientation. So we need to have all of these pieces of information to understand how can we create the best educational content for them. The role of coercion in sexual assault, how do they think about coercion? And is what they think normal behavior, is that actually coercion? Because that happens a lot. Issues of consent, bystander interventions, and also the what are the legal laws that are in place to protect them from these things? And are they aware of that? Because I'll speak for myself, I wasn't aware of a lot of things. And I think that kind of got in the way of me knowing um, how to protect myself because I didn't know that I deserved to be protected in those times. So, in sum, we know that the most effective programs aimed at college students use a comprehensive prevention approach. Um, we strongly recommend that take what you can from this presentation, right? Not what you can't. If nothing else, just remember that a combination of different ways of protecting yourself against acquaintance assault, especially, plus different kinds of culture change, is what's proven to be the most effective way to reduce sexual assault. Thank you.
All right. I
And
think we can
we're
open it
happy
up
to
to
take any
questions.
questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly.
Mhm.
I think the thing that I'll just, I don't know, hop in here, because people are making comments, they're not asking questions yet, but
Beth has a question.
oh,
Also.
Beth, okay.
Yeah.
How successful
And
have
would
you
you
been?
mind not like stopping the show?
Oh, you want me to stop the share? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a good point. That's a good point, and we can see each other. Um, so I'll come back to that question in just a second. I think what I want people to take away is that you can design programs for your population that combine these things in a way that's meaningful for you. You don't have to have every single step that we have in elemental or prevent and protect or EAAA. The key is what kinds of verbal self-defense tools, what kinds of non-violent physical self-defense tools, what kinds of violent physical self-defense, if I want to incorporate that, how do I do that, right? What kinds of tools can I bring together with the education piece to give people a variety of different things that they can utilize? Because for elemental and EAAA to have a 66% reduction in sexual violence when we've got 40 years of programming that weren't able to impact SVV rates at all is pretty monumental. So there's something about combining these things that's really where the magic happens. So really, I want you to think about what kinds of programs would I need to develop for my organization, my population that would combine these things in a way that would be meaningful to help me move the needle in the way I want. Okay, so Beth's question, how successful have you been in getting buy-in from universities for these approaches? Excellent question, Beth. some good, some not good, right? So the thing that is difficult about these programs at the collegiate level for large scale buy-in is they're not scalable for thousands of students at a time, right? So we teach 10, 15, 20, 30 students max at a time. I have trained individuals at a variety of universities across the United States on like how to teach elemental on their campuses. I don't do that anymore, but I have done that in the past. So there was definitely success in kind of proliferating it that way. EAAA has done the same thing. You know, you can go to EAAA's website and you can get their curriculum and all of those kinds of things. But you typically have to spend a lot of time having individuals who are trained to teach the program, and they can only teach programs in small pockets. So the university buy-in is not like a university that adopts it for every incoming freshman, which would be ideal. I have people tell me all the time, every student should take these kinds of programs. Absolutely, but the amount of financial backing that would be required to make that happen is pretty intense. Small organizations who are working with smaller populations, not thousands and thousands of students at a time, I think it's a little bit easier for folks to do this. So I spend a lot more time now just kind of helping people think through what would I do if I wanted to design a program for my organization as opposed to teaching people elemental specifically. I hope that answers your question. Do you have anything to add there, Ashna?
Yes,
Yeah.
I do. Okay, so I had a pretty different experience than Melissa in getting buy-in because I was doing it in India where no one wants to talk about sexual violence, right? So that's why, once again, I think it's important to know your audience. It's important to understand their culture, and it's important to align your goals in a way that they understand their goals. So, for example, I realized like when I was saying sexual violence is a problem in India, people took that really personally, right? And they said, no, you're just coming in from America, telling us all these things because you have no respect for our country, blah, 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 right? So after some trial and error, I realized that the Indian government and therefore Indian universities were riding this wave of women empowerment. And then that's how I got buy-in by marketing myself as a person who does women empowerment work. So once again, I think the buy-in is key to understanding your audience because you're not going to get buy-in if you come in with what you think is the most important thing because they may not think that,
Hmm.
especially if they're people who are not focused on this. Because at the end of the day, the focus of a university is educating people and making money, right? Their focus is not the same as that of ICESA. So if I came to ICESA and said, let's do this thing to prevent sexual violence, you'd be like, oh, heck yes. But that doesn't mean everyone cares about the same thing. So we just have to figure out how to market ourselves in a way that appeals to them. Because this is good work and this is important work. And just because buy-in is a struggle doesn't mean that we should give up.
Excellent. Felisa asks, how does it relate to Title IX?
Mm-hmm.
On a college campus, it's integral to Title IX, right? And so one of the things that we talk about, again, from my perspective, and I think anybody who works in this field recognizes that sexual violence in and of itself is a multifaceted problem, and it needs a multifaceted approach. And so, um, a comprehensive program like Elemental or EAAA or Prevent and Protect or anything else that somebody designs is a piece of that puzzle for, in this case, at a college level, Title IX compliance, right? Title IX requires you to, have certain levels of training, and the Campus Save Act requires that all campuses provide primary prevention to their students. So these programs provide primary prevention. They also actually provide risk reduction or empowerment based training, which is again what the CDC now calls it. And the CDC and the ACHA now both suggest that colleges do both of these things in tandem. So again, in the early 2000s, they're like, no, 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 no more risk reduction. That was the pendulum swing one way. They've kind of come back around based on the research from these programs and said, there's probably something to this combined approach, and we shouldn't be throwing the baby out with the bathwater and just saying no more risk reduction. We need to do it in a good way. We need to do it. It's got to be nuanced. It's got to have choice. It's got to have availability to people. It can't be telling people how to dress. It's got to get rid of all of the bad things that were associated with the way we did it in the 80s. Make it look more nuanced, more modern. Combine it with this education, and then it actually helps with Title IX compliance quite a lot. Again, the scalability is always an issue, but having these things take place as part of programming in the dorms or residence halls, I guess is what we're supposed to call them these days, you know, little pockets of programming. So you might not hit every student, but you're going to hit a lot of students. That can certainly be part of that process. Um, and I think that that kind of gets to Whitney's question when she said, I second Beth's question, how do you get support from the university or any organization to implement this? Ashna's right. What language do you need to get the buy-in, right? Ashna just finished an internship in the state of Florida where you can't say things like diversity and sexual violence and all kinds of things, right? So she's very skilled in figuring out how to give the training necessary to people by using the words that are allowed or are people are receptive to, etc. And so we actually all find ourselves in a rather strange, awkward, unfortunate environment right now around these issues. And so I think we all have to become super skilled in figuring out what do I need to say to appeal to people so that they will
Hmm.
recognize that this work is worthy of being
Yeah.
done. And so empowerment-based training is a lovely way of doing that without saying sexual violence prevention, maybe, right?
Hmm.
So I'm going to
Yeah.
stop because I'm going off on a
Yeah.
tangent, but
Whitney, I had another suggestion. Something that I found myself doing a lot in India and in Florida is I just started to read every single like policy statement that they had, all of the mission statements, the vision statements, right? Because that is what I find the organization administrators usually prioritize. And that's like for a university or that's for an NGO or whatever it is. So, for example, in India, I basically found this organization that was doing youth sexuality education, but they didn't call it that. They called it life skills education. Okay. And I just thought, I don't care what they call it. They're still doing what I want them to be doing. And I still want them to partner with me and I want to get in, right? So I have found like just the big picture, mission, vision, policy statements. Like in Ball State, there's this thing called Flight Path to 2040, right? And then I read that and then I thought, okay, this is how it ties into things. When I was in Florida, I used to just like read all of the emails that the new president used to send out to figure out how the work I want to do like overlaps with what they think they want or what they say they want. And in India, I went to the extent of reading all of the transcripts of the right-wing prime minister's speeches to figure out, okay, how can I overlap this with what I want to be doing? So those are just some ideas for getting support.